2022 was a busy year on Capitol Hill. The House and Senate passed historic legislation, conducted important investigations, and chose new leaders for the next Congress, among other important events. And let's not forget about those November midterm elections, when voters weighed in on representation in Congress for the next 2 years. Here are the 9 biggest congressional moments of 2022. A top story on Capitol Hill this year was the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, which began in late February. Russia's invasion of Ukraine prompted widespread condemnation in the US and from NATO countries, with allied nations coming to Kyiv's defense. And part of that defense in the US has involved financial support, millions of dollars worth. Congress has passed 3 aid packages for Ukraine between March and September, sending Kyiv more than $60 billion since the conflict began, and the administration is already asking for more. But those aid packages didn't come without some controversy on Capitol Hill. Both chambers passed a $40 billion aid package in May, but a handful of Republicans voted no, forming a contingent of the party that has questioned what the aid is being used for and raised whether or not the US should be sending more money overseas. The topic is likely to come up again in the next year. Next up, the confirmation of Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. Shortly after former Justice Stephen Breyer announced that he would step down from the Supreme Court, President Biden nominated federal appeals judge Ketanji Brown Jackson to be his successor, making his first mark on the highest court in the country. In April, after a series of meetings and hearings on Capitol Hill, the Senate confirmed Jackson in a 53-47 vote, with 3 Republicans joining all Democrats in support. The vote was historic. Jackson is the first Black woman to be confirmed to the bench. Now, let's fast forward to June, when the House Select Committee investigating the January 6th attack on the Capitol held its first of 9 public hearings, laying out its case to the American people that former President Trump was at the center of a conspiracy to keep himself in power. The hearings were loaded with information. They featured never-before-seen footage of the riot, live testimony from Trump administration officials and Justice Department personnel, and videos from the closed-door depositions that the committee conducted with Trump family members, close allies, and others. At the end of the 9th hearing, the committee voted unanimously to subpoena Trump for documents and testimony relevant to the panel's investigation. The move was characterized as remarkable and historic. Trump, however, has not complied with the request. He sued the committee after it issued its subpoena to avoid having to testify. The committee is set to dissolve at the end of this year when Republicans take control of the House, putting an end to the congressional investigation that has been a top focus on Capitol Hill since the deadly riot in January 2021. Switching gears to policy now, the House and Senate passed a gun safety bill in June, marking the first time in nearly 30 years that Congress had approved major legislation to combat gun violence. The measure, titled the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, passed through both chambers with bipartisan support, and President Biden signed it into law. The legislation enhances background checks for gun purchasers ages 18 to 21, creates a federal offense for people who obtain firearms through straw purchases or trafficking, and it clarifies the definition of a federally licensed firearm dealer. It also closed the boyfriend loophole and included funding for mental health treatment and red flag laws, among other tenets. Passage of the gun bill followed a number of mass shootings in the country, including one in May, where 19 students and 2 adults were killed at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas. Days before that, 10 individuals were killed at a grocery store in Buffalo, New York. Now, over to the Supreme Court, which released a seismic decision on June 24th that sent shockwaves throughout Capitol Hill. On that day, the Supreme Court released a ruling that upheld Mississippi's 15-week abortion ban. But in doing that, the bench struck down Roe v. Wade, the nearly 50-year-old decision that made abortion access a constitutional right. The decision shook Capitol Hill, with Republicans lauding the development and Democrats raising alarm about the future of reproductive rights in America. The House has since passed bills aimed at protecting abortion access, but the measures have stalled in the Senate. And with such a slim Democratic majority, they're unlikely to move at all. The court's decision over the summer also set off another legislative scramble, one to protect same-sex marriage after Justice Clarence Thomas called for the bench to reconsider one of the decisions safeguarding that right. More on that later. It was a busy summer on Capitol Hill. In August, Democrats landed a significant victory by passing a sweeping tax, healthcare, and climate change bill, ticking off a number of items on the party's legislative wish list. The bill passed through both chambers along party lines with the help of Vice President Kamala Harris's tie-breaking vote in the Senate.
The Vice President votes in the affirmative and the motion to proceed is agreed to.
President Biden ultimately signed it into law, notching a significant victory ahead of the midterm elections. Passage of the $740 billion bill, titled the Inflation Reduction Act, followed more than a year of negotiations between Democrats, specifically Senator Joe Manchin, who was a key vote to getting the measure over the finish line. The bill raises taxes on corporations, addresses climate change, lowers prescription drug costs, and reduces the deficit. And about those midterms I just mentioned, the November elections were another top story on Capitol Hill this year. After months of campaigning, candidates were put to the test in November as Americans headed to the polls to determine congressional representation for the next 2 years. Republicans flipped control of the House, and Democrats retained their majority in the Senate, giving both parties a cause for celebration, but the margins in both chambers remain razor thin. A main storyline of the night was the better-than-expected performance by Democrats, who fended off the red wave that many Republicans and pundits had predicted. Democrats won a number of competitive races across the country and secured victories in contests that were considered toss-ups. But Republicans did notch one significant win. They toppled the chair of the House Democrats' campaign arm, Sean Patrick Maloney, from New York, a symbolic win for the conference as it heads into the majority. Shortly after the midterms, Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Majority Leader Steny Hoyer, and Whip James Clyburn announced that they would step down from the top of the House Democratic leadership next year, marking the first shakeup to the caucus's top brass in nearly 2 decades. Pelosi, who's led the party in the House for 20 years, announced in a speech on the floor that she would not run for a leadership position in the next Congress, putting an end to her historic run at the helm of the caucus. Shortly after that, Hoyer and Clyburn announced that they would also not seek the top 3 spots, paving the way for a new generation of Democrats to take on the party's reins. And that rise didn't take long. Hakeem Jeffries, Catherine Clark, and Pete Aguilar, a trio long seen as successors to Pelosi and her lieutenants, quickly announced bids for the top spots. And in December, the caucus voted to install them as the new Democratic leader, whip, and chair of the House Democratic Caucus, respectively. It was a historic vote. Jeffries, a congressman from New York, became the first Black individual to lead either party in either chamber. And to cap off the year, Congress passed a bill to protect marriage equality on the federal level in a bipartisan fashion, sending the measure to President Biden's desk for his signature. The measure, titled the Respect for Marriage Act, codified protections for same-sex marriage that were initially written by the Supreme Court in the 2015 case Obergefell v. Hodges. Some fear that the protections were in jeopardy after the bench struck down Roe and Thomas, a conservative justice, called on the court to reconsider the Obergefell case. The vote was bipartisan in both the House and the Senate. A handful of Republicans came on board in the upper chamber after a bipartisan group of senators proposed an amendment that outlines protections for religious liberties. Senator Tammy Baldwin, a sponsor of the bill and a member of the LGBTQ community, said it was a historic day after the Senate passed the bill. And with all that, 2022 was quite a year for Congress. But one thing's for sure, politics and policy will continue to be a central focus on Capitol Hill in the next year.